In Turkey, as Muslims, and in Canada as Christians, one of the common barriers is that we are powerful in our culture, and that we're unable, because we're in such majority and unable to see clearly. The culture is embedded in our faith and supports our faith. I know that's, our culture doesn't, and the Turkish culture with its secularism doesn't, but that's another issue we need to talk about. So our hearing and our sight are partially blinded by living in a world where other voices are not available to us on a regular basis. We don't see others very well. When there's holidays, or the weekly schedule, or symbols in the culture, or food, or the regulation of food, or prayers, or religious leaders are appearing in the media and other places. How do others live in our culture? Could there be values that they bring that we miss by being a majority in our culture? And how do other people in our world live, and do we not see them? Though I knew of Sabbath as Friday, Saturday for Jews, and Muslim prayers on Friday, it wasn't until I actually was in Israel, and all of a sudden I was up on Sunday morning to try to go to worship services, and everybody else was headed for work. And then I also knew the Christians are only 4% of the population in Israel-Palestine. And then I also started to listen to a Christian Palestinian family whose children needed to go to school and couldn't go to worship because of the routine of the weekday schedule. They did take them out for holidays. Do we marginalize people of other faiths in Canada? I know we do, and it helped me to see that when I was in Israel. As a person in a secular culture in Canada, I have many questions and ask politicians about the opening session of our provincial parliament, which was like an Anglican worship service, with tradition from the United Kingdom and the colonial days. Special guests included only the Catholic, the Anglican, the United, and the Salvation Army religious leaders. Although members of the provincial parliament were Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, and Jewish. From my experience in interfaith dialogue, I was deeply disturbed by the whole experience and asked my MP and other MPP and others questions. I was again invited to the next time when the legislature started in our province, and I was glad to see that seated on the floor with the MPPs were members of the Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, Hindu, and other Christian groups which had not been represented before. Yet I was deeply disturbed. Except for the Lord's Prayer, which is Christian tradition. There was no other faith dimension, and yet we're asking people who are our MPPs, members of provincial parliament, to be ethical and moral and have roots that help us to shape our society. Yet everything became very, very secular with the exception of one prayer. Would ethics, morality, and community be important in the decision-making of this particular legislative session? My eyes were opened even more as I went to Turkey and heard concerns about the secular government and the universities where practices of faith are not recognized. Specifically, our group heard from women who had to take off their hijab in government offices or at the university. When we met with the politicians and government workers in their offices, I did not see evidence of hijab and other things that I felt could have been there for people. And I began to wonder and reflect, where is secularity taking us in Turkey and in Canada? And how are we talking together? As our Western world becomes even more secular, how do I respond as a Christian? How do I respond as a person of faith who wishes that all people can practice their faith? Can Turkish and Canadian residents have a conversation about the relationship of faith and secularity? Both our countries have governments which, for good reasons, have become more secular and have separated some of the faith dimensions. But is there a new way of doing this? For example, in Ontario, in the early 80s, a premier and a Catholic cardinal created a compromise in which Ontario fully funded the Catholic separate school system or public school system from junior kindergarten all the way through grade 12. Then it was grade 13. Among some of our predominant religious Christian faith groups, there has been a theory that religious leaders can whisper in the ears of the politician and changes occur. Unfortunately, this doesn't often work for people who are, for the poor, who I usually am advocating for, but it has happened more and more. But this no longer works, even for those who are cardinals and bishops and rabbis and on and on. for when we try as interfaith groups to get the ear of the premier and to come and have an official delegation meet with him, with all the religions there, they no longer schedule us for appointments and keep putting us off and putting us off and putting us off. We have been meeting with MPPs, and we have been learning to find our place about asking questions and wondering about certain people who suffer and proposing actions which will relieve the suffering of people, particularly the poor and the marginalized. Might we as Turkish and Canadian people discuss how we as religious leaders can speak with politicians and governments to relieve the suffering in our world? Could we not use the resources of all of our traditions? The good aspect of losing our power as Christians in Canada and in Ontario is that we begin to understand and identify with other marginalized people. Those who are poor, minority populations, disabled, new Canadians, Aboriginals. We sense ourselves a loss of dignity, a loss of voice. And can we begin to see that as a gift, that we can now walk alongside people who suffer even though we don't suffer in the same way they do. As we lose our voice, we have commonality with those who are often suffering and isolated. But our loss of voice helps us to walk with others then from other faith traditions. In our interfaith circles in Waterloo region, we are very careful that no faith community is ever in the majority. So like the Christians are never over 50% of the people attending an interfaith discussion, primarily so that everybody has an ability to speak. And we've learned that by knowing that we have to do that in order for everybody to have a voice, just as we lost our voice. Now, going back to barriers, David Lochhead says that some of our Christian brothers and sisters, and I think it happens in the Muslim community as well, are unwilling to join our interfaith dialogue and action. Some have isolated themselves. In my tradition, the Amish and the Old Order Mennonites and some others would have isolated themselves, and they try to opt partly out of the society. Some are hostile and display hostility to other faiths. In our Christian traditions in the Lutheran community, some of our Missouri Synod Lutheran pastors cannot participate in an interfaith exchange without being asked to turn in their credentials as a pastor or being disciplined in some profound way. And it happens in other faith group or other Christian traditions as well. And some are competing to gain superiority with other people. And Lochhead, I think, is very interesting because he says competition is actually hostility. And it's interesting. I've been trying to think that one through, but as I try to grow my community to be bigger and bigger and bigger, am I actually subtly hostile to other communities who are around me? But finally, Lochhead comes through and he says, many of us can be partners. And to be partners, we need to collaborate together and see ourselves in unity with other people.